I have arranged for Celia Marrow to live just across the gallery from my wife.
When Anwin learned that her husband had given his mistress a chamber across the gallery from her own, she did not scream, faint, or throw the woman from the house. She stood in the long withdrawing room of Aldrich Hall with her hands folded at her waist, while the servants lowered their eyes, and Lord Aldrich smiled, as if humiliation were a form of entertainment owed to him by marriage. He had married her 11 months earlier for land, influence, and the lawful grip her inheritance gave him over the last profitable acres belonging to her mother's family. He had never tried to be kind. What made him monstrous was not open brutality alone, but the polished ease with which he treated cruelty as his natural privilege. He mocked her reserve, called her cold before witnesses, then whispered to his friends that his young wife had failed him in every duty that mattered between husband and wife. The truth that he had never once approached her marriage bed without drink, anger, or contempt, and had not been man enough to consummate the union he used to imprison her, was buried beneath his louder version of events. By the beginning of autumn in 1778, most of the county believed Lady Anwin Aldrich was a disappointingly frigid wife, living under the patience of an offended husband. Only the walls of Aldrich Hall knew better. They knew the late-night arguments. They knew the locked door between his chamber and hers. They knew the sound of laughter drifting from the west wing after he installed Celia Marrow, a widow of flexible virtue, under the insulting fiction that she had come as a companion for his wife. If you are drawn to stories where a woman is pushed to the very edge of disgrace before truth begins to turn in her favor, where the powerful mistake silence for surrender, and where justice arrives only after courage learns how to speak, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. At first, Anwin endured because she had been trained to endure. Her mother had died telling her that rank could shelter a woman if she learned when not to provoke it. Her father, a smaller landholder with an old name and weak accounts, had spent his last healthy years insisting that marriage to Aldrich would secure the family line. By the time Anwin understood what kind of man Aldrich truly was, the settlements were signed. Her father was dead, and every steward, tenant, and creditor around her answered to her husband's seal. Then he brought Celia to supper. The woman wore plum silk and a smile too knowing for innocence. Aldrich seated her at his right hand and instructed Anwin to direct the kitchen as if she were hostess to her own replacement. When Anwin rose to leave, he said, lightly, before the footman, "Stay, my lady. Mrs. Marrow has a talent for enlivening a room you have kept funereal for months." Anwin sat back down because rage, in a house like that, was safest when hidden. But something small and final shifted inside her. Humiliation had once felt like weather, miserable, inescapable, and ordained from above. That night, it became evidence. The next morning, she began to keep notes. Not romantic diary pages, not tear-stained complaints. Facts, dates, remarks made before witnesses, missing rents, copies of letters, the names of tenants charged twice for timber rights, the unusual transfer of silver plate to a merchant in York, the sudden alteration of a boundary survey that had once favored the modest estate left to her by her mother's brother. Aldrich called her dull because she spoke little. He never imagined quiet could also mean observant. What she did not know was that someone else had begun to observe Lord Aldrich, too. The Duke of Vexley arrived in the county under the official purpose of reviewing militia supply disputes and plantation transport claims tied to the war. He was not a duke in the English courtly sense, so much as a powerful American nobleman by habit, fortune, and reputation. A widowed magnate whose title had clung to him from old family usage, and whose influence moved through Virginia like weather over deep water. Men feared him because he was patient. Women studied him because grief had made him grave without making him soft. Anwin first saw him at the parish assembly, where Aldrich had taken Celia openly and left his wife to walk behind them as if she were the least desired member of her own household. Vexley watched the arrangement for one measured instant too long. Later, while Aldrich drank and boasted over cards, the Duke asked Anwin for a dance she knew he did not want and she could not easily refuse. "You have been publicly wronged," he said as they turned through the set. She kept her face still. "That is not a fashionable subject for dancing, Your Grace." "No, but truth rarely arrives in fashionable rooms." She should have withdrawn. Instead, she said, "Truth also grows costly when spoken aloud." His expression changed, not into pity but recognition. "My sister believed that once. It killed her." The words were so bare that Anwin looked up. He did not explain further then. He did not need to. She saw in his restraint the outline of an old wound. A woman married into respectability, mistreated in private, and failed by everyone who preferred decorum to intervention. When the dance ended, he returned her to the wall without presumption. But 2 days later, a solicitor known to work under Vexley's protection called at Aldrich Hall on business involving river freight ledgers and timber contracts. From there, the pressure began. Aldrich grew more irritable. He shouted at clerks, sent riders out after dark, and twice demanded keys from the steward that had never previously concerned him. Celia became sharp with fear beneath her practiced ease. Bills were removed from the study fire half burned. A tenant's son was dismissed for asking about missing receipts. Anwin watched all of it and understood, slowly, that her husband's power was not solid stone. It was patched wood painted to resemble stone, and somewhere beneath the paint, rot had started. The Duke did not come to rescue her like a hero from a ballad. He moved instead through law, account books, and men who feared prison more than scandal. Fraud in wartime transport, altered assessments, mortgaged lands represented twice in different counties, a forged signature on a debt transfer that touched the estate once intended for Anwin's maternal line. Each finding alone might have been managed. Together, they formed a structure of deceit too broad to hide forever. Still, exposure required more than Vexley's will. It required Anwin herself. One rain-heavy evening, he asked to speak with her in the old library while Aldrich was away inspecting a warehouse seizure. The room smelled of damp leather and extinguished fire. "I can break him publicly," Vexley said. "But if I do so without your direct petition, the county will treat you as an object transferred from one man's custody to another's. That would preserve your safety and destroy your name." Anwin stood beside the long window, fingers tight around the wood. "My name is already damaged." "Damaged is not destroyed." She turned toward him. "You speak as if the distinction matters to society. It matters to the law if used correctly, and it matters to me." There was no seduction in his voice, only seriousness. He laid out the path before her, a petition for annulment on grounds of non-consummation, fraudulent inducement, and malicious public injury. A separate claim challenging Aldrich's control over the estate wrongfully absorbed through falsified papers. Sworn testimony from servants willing to speak, if protected. Financial records linking Aldrich to broader transport fraud. And one further possibility. A surviving male relative from Anwin's mother's line whose legal standing had been deliberately obscured years earlier. "My brother is dead," she said. "Not dead," Vexley answered. "Missing to you, living in Maryland under another branch of the family. He has been found." For the first time in months, perhaps years, the world seemed to tilt beneath her, not from terror, but from hope too sudden to bear easily. Her brother Rowan arrived 6 days later, leaner than she remembered, sun-browned, angry, and very much alive. Their embrace in the side garden left Mrs. Bell in tears, and 2 footmen staring fixedly at the gravel for decency's sake. Rowan had been pushed from inheritance expectation after a chain of legal manipulations following their mother's death, then sent away under the pretense of apprenticeship and debt settlement. He came back carrying copies of letters, a minister's record, and enough fury to light every window in the house. Aldrich returned that night to find his wife no longer alone. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded. Rowan answered before Anwin could. "The beginning of your inconvenience." It was not yet the beginning of his fall, but it was close. The weeks that followed tested Anwin more than all the earlier humiliations. To seek an annulment was to invite public examination of the most private wound in her marriage. Men smirked behind legal language. Women asked careful questions designed to taste of sympathy while feeding on disgrace. Celia, cornered by Aldrich's temper and the Duke's inquiries, attempted to leave with a jewel case not entirely her own, and was stopped at dawn by a sheriff carrying Vexley's authority. She wept, denied, then confessed enough to save herself. Aldrich had boasted to her. Aldrich had hidden records. Aldrich had laughed about keeping his wife untouched and therefore unprovable, while he spent her inheritance by right of marriage. The line, once spoken under oath, moved through the county like fire through dry reeds. Yet even then, Anwin nearly faltered. On the morning of the church court hearing, she stood in her chamber, unable to lace her own hands into steadiness. Vexley found her there only because Rowan, wise enough at last, stopped pretending courage was best served by leaving her alone. "I do not fear him," Anwin said, staring at the rain on the glass. "I fear the room. I fear that once these things are said, I shall never belong to myself again." Vexley came no closer than honor allowed. "You already do not belong to yourself while he keeps the law on his side." She shut her eyes. "When my sister petitioned for help," he said quietly, "everyone around her advised patience. They praised dignity while she was being destroyed by it. I could not save her because I arrived too late and believed propriety deserved one more hour. I will not make that mistake again. But this hour is still yours, Anwin. If you enter that room, it must be by your own will." That was what steadied her, not power offered over her head, but the return of choice. She opened her eyes. "Then let it be my will." The hearing filled the parish chamber beyond comfort. Aldrich came dressed with insulting care, as if tailoring could restore authority already loosening at the seams. He tried contempt first, then wounded male pride, then outrage that a wife should parade domestic disappointment before strangers. But contempt works poorly once paperwork begins to speak. The physician testified. The servant who tended the adjoining chambers testified. Celia testified with blotched cheeks and ruined elegance. Rowan produced the family letters proving deliberate concealment of the maternal estate. Vexley's solicitor laid out the transport frauds one ledger at a time. And finally, Anwin herself stood before the minister, the magistrates, and the county worthies who had watched her disgrace as social amusement, and said in a calm voice that her marriage had been a prison built of legal forms, ridicule, and theft. "He wished me shamed enough to remain obedient," she said. "He believed that because he had denied me the rights of a wife, I could never claim the freedoms of an injured woman. He was wrong." Nothing in the room sounded louder than the silence that followed. The decree did not come instantly, but the outcome was sealed there. Within a fortnight, the marriage was annulled. Aldrich's financial frauds spread into formal charges. His claim over the disputed estate was frozen, then overturned. Properties tied to false transfer instruments were restored to the rightful line. Rowan's standing was acknowledged, and Anwin, who had entered Aldrich Hall as a valuable appendage, left it under her own name, with lawful control returned over what should never have been stolen from her family at all. The county, having fed on her humiliation, now discovered a taste for admiring her composure. Anwin accepted none of it. She moved with Rowan into the smaller maternal house while repairs began on the reclaimed estate. She dismissed servants who had delighted too openly in past cruelties and retained those who had shown kindness when kindness was costly. She learned the accounts herself. She walked the boundary lines with tenants. She sat with solicitors until the language of property, settlement, and rental rights ceased to feel like a male dialect from which she had been intentionally excluded. Vexley remained nearby, though never oppressively so. He visited on estate business. He advised when asked. He listened more than he spoke. Between them grew something quieter and more dangerous than gratitude. Anwin trusted him first because he had not treated her suffering as a prelude to possession. Later she came to love him because he saw not only what had been done to her, but what she was becoming beyond it. Their understanding declared itself one winter evening in the half-restored west parlor, where crates still stood against the wall and new curtains had not yet been hung. Snow light-silvered the windows. Rowan had gone to town. The house was at last peaceful enough for silence not to feel like fear. "You have changed this place," Vexley said, looking around the room. "No," Anwin answered softly. "I think I have changed inside it." He studied her with that grave steadiness she had first noticed on the dance floor months before. "That is what I meant." She might once have lowered her eyes. Instead, she held his gaze. "I did not know," she said, "that healing could feel less like softness and more like structure. Brick laid back in the right places, a door rehung so it closes against weather." A faint, sad smile touched him. "You speak like a builder now." "I was forced to become one." "Then whoever stands beside you in future will have to deserve the house you have rebuilt." There are moments when love begins not with surprise, but with recognition too long delayed. Anwin crossed the space between them by her own choosing. When Vexley took her hand, it was with reverence stripped of performance. "I do not offer rescue," he said. "Good," she replied. "I have had enough of cages mistaken for protection." What he offered instead was partnership, patience, and a devotion made more trustworthy by restraint. Their marriage, when it came the following spring, was not a transaction arranged over her head, but a vow entered with open eyes. The county called her Duchess soon afterward, half in admiration and half because power had become easier to respect once attached to visible rank. Anwin wore the title without letting it erase the woman who had won it. She never returned to Aldrich Hall except once, years later, to sign the final sale papers after the estate had been broken apart to settle debts and penalties. The great house smelled of damp stone and extinguished vanity. She felt no triumph walking through it, only distance. That, more than revenge, was her true liberation. Lord Aldrich had wanted a silent wife, a captive fortune, and a house where humiliation could be staged like music after supper. Instead, he gave the world a witness against himself. He mistook her patience for emptiness, her reserve for weakness, and her silence for consent. By the time he understood the difference, the law had turned, the records had surfaced, and the woman he had tried to reduce had stepped fully beyond his reach. Anwin's life did not become perfect after that. No honest life does. But it became her own. She restored the estate taken from her bloodline. She protected Rowan's rightful place without yielding her own. She learned the shape of justice in ledgers as well as in feeling. And when she finally stood beside Vexley, not as a victim under protection, but as a respected duchess freely loved, the deepest change was not in her title. It was in the quiet certainty with which she inhabited it. She had begun as a woman taught to survive disgrace by making herself smaller inside it. She became a woman who understood another law entirely. Nothing heals cleanly until truth is named. Nothing is reclaimed until fear releases its hold. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not ruin dealt to the cruel, but the calm, public, undeniable proof that they never owned the future they tried to steal. When Anwin first understood that her husband intended to make a theater of her humiliation, she was standing beneath the painted ceiling of Aldrich Hall's long withdrawing room, while rain moved against the windows like handfuls of thrown seed, and the household waited to see how much shame a gentle woman could be made to swallow without protest. Lord Aldrich had chosen the hour carefully. Supper was ended, but the candles were still high. 2 neighboring landholders had not yet departed. His steward lingered near the door with a packet of rent papers. 3 footmen stood in formal stillness along the wall, and in the center of the room, framed by gilt mirrors and a fire built high for display rather than comfort, stood Celia Marrow in plum silk, one gloved hand resting lightly on the carved back of a chair, as though she had already begun to learn the room by touch. "Mrs. Marrow will be staying with us for a season," Aldrich said, the corners of his mouth bent in that polished half-smile he used when he meant to be especially cruel. "The west chamber across the gallery has been prepared for her. I believe my wife will be grateful for cultivated female company, since she has shown so little inclination to enliven this house herself." No one spoke. That was the genius of a man like Aldrich. He rarely needed raised voices. He understood that if he placed degradation inside the forms of gentility, other people would help him carry it. A servant would lower his eyes. A guest would make himself deaf. A woman dependent on courtesy would hesitate 1 second too long before defending another woman. Shame did the rest. Anwin did not faint. She did not weep. She did not demand that the widow be turned from the house. She merely felt, with terrible clarity, the heat rise under her skin, while every person in the room pretended this arrangement belonged to hospitality rather than insult. Celia dipped her head with a softness too practiced to be innocent. "Her ladyship is generous." "My wife," Aldrich said, "is many things. We must all be thankful when generosity is among them." A short laugh followed from one of the neighboring gentlemen, uncertain and late, but enough. Anwin folded her hands at her waist to keep them steady. 11 months earlier, she had entered this house under legal vows, carrying with her the last secure claim attached to her mother's family lands. Since then, she had been corrected, displayed, contradicted, and diminished with a patience so deliberate that it had almost convinced her the injury was partly her own fault. Aldrich called her cold in public and impossible in private. He hinted that she had failed him in the marriage chamber. He let county society believe she was frigid, delicate, and unfit for the ordinary warmth of married life. The truth was more humiliating than the lie, which was why he trusted it to remain hidden. He had never truly made her his wife at all. He drank, he raged, he boasted, he slammed his hand against door frames and cursed her reserve, and twice came to her chamber reeking of wine and thwarted male vanity. But whatever weakness lay at the root of his fury, he never crossed the final threshold he had used society to suggest she had denied him. He left her untouched in the narrow legal sense, while still making certain that everyone around them believed the failure belonged to her. That inversion had trapped her more efficiently than force. A neglected wife might invite sympathy. A disappointing wife invited scrutiny. A husband mocked in masculine expectation could always find listeners eager to laugh with him. So when he gave his mistress a chamber across the gallery from Anwin's own, he was not beginning her degradation. He was crowning it. And yet, standing in that room, with the servants turned to stone and Celia poised like a woman stepping into a role she had long rehearsed in smaller houses, Anwin felt something in herself grow harder rather than weaker. Humiliation had always seemed to arrive like weather. That night, it arrived like evidence. If you are drawn to stories where a woman is pushed toward disgrace until silence itself turns into a weapon, where the powerful mistake patience for surrender, and where justice comes only after courage learns how to speak in its own name, like this video and subscribe to Quiet Fires of America. Later, when the house had gone still except for the small domestic sounds that survive any scandal, the settling of coals, the creak of boards, a servant crossing the back passage with a lamp, Anwin stood in her chamber and looked at the locked door connecting it to the room once meant for her husband. She had stared at that door so often over the past year that it had become almost a second piece of furniture, mute and hateful and absurd. On the night of their marriage, Aldrich had stood on the other side of it, too drunk to conceal his temper and too vain to conceal his humiliation. He had accused her of stiffness before he touched her, then stormed away before he could fail where only the dark would see him. He had done variations of that many times since. The household learned the pattern without ever hearing it explained. A burst of temper, a slammed latch. His absence the next morning, followed by some public remark about female ice and private disappointment. Then, as months passed, the gradual addition of a second fiction, that he nobly endured what a weaker man might have exposed more brutally. Anwin sat at the small escritoire by the window and opened a blank page. For several moments, she did not write. She listened instead to the rain and to the pulse in her own throat. A lady did not keep records against her husband. A lady prayed, endured, appealed softly to older women, and was advised to preserve peace. A lady was told that rank could shelter her if she did not provoke the walls that enclosed her. Then she remembered Celia's hand on the chair, and Aldrich's voice presenting cruelty as if it were a refinement of household management. She dipped the pen. September 19th, 1778. Mrs. Celia Marrow installed in West Chamber across from my own. Statement made before Mr. Fenwick, Mr. Hales, Mr. Pritchard, Steward Bell, footmen James, Thomas, and Lewis. She paused, then added, "Previous pattern of remarks concerning my supposed coldness continued. No consummation. Lock between chambers unchanged." The words made her flush, yet she did not strike them out. That first page became 3 before midnight. Dates, witnesses, specific remarks. The steward asked to alter a timber tally after supper with the York merchant. A chest of plate sent away for polishing and not returned. Tenants complaining of duplicate rent demands. A boundary survey from her mother's side of the family amended in ink darker than the original hand. Her husband's increasing reliance on private messengers after dark. Celia's arrival not as the beginning of sin in the house, but as the point at which secrecy grew careless. By dawn, Anwin had not slept, but she had done something almost as useful. She had begun. At first, no one noticed the change in her because the change was inward. Aldrich saw only that she remained decorous. Celia saw only that Lady Aldrich neither welcomed nor challenged her, which the widow mistook for defeat. The servants, trained by long practice to ignore what they understood too well, continued moving through the household as if insult were another item of furniture to dust around. But Anwin's silence was no longer empty. It had direction. She listened when the kitchen maid whispered that the York merchant's man had come twice in 1 week for papers instead of wine. She noticed when the old overseer from the lower tract left the study white with anger and refused mulled cider in the yard before riding off. She watched Bell the steward hover over ledgers he had once carried openly through the hall. She began asking, in that mild voice no one feared because it belonged to a gentlewoman, whether certain rents had been received, whether the orchard lease had been renewed, whether the silver had returned from polishing, whether the southern boundary markers had been replaced after the storm. People answered more than they intended because they assumed she did not understand the significance of what she heard. She understood enough to feel the outline of something rotting beneath Aldrich's confidence. By October, the county had accepted Celia Marrow as a semi-public fixture of Aldrich Hall. Women condemned it, with the livelier interest reserved for scandals that happened safely to someone else. Men shrugged and suggested that a gentleman must find cheer where his own wife offered none. One old aunt told Anwin with appalling kindness that it was wise not to contest a husband too directly in his own house, especially when a woman's manner had perhaps failed to secure his attachment in earlier months. Anwin thanked her and thought, with a shock that almost felt like freedom, that if she did not begin to hate such advice soon, she might drown in it. The Duke of Vexley came into the county under the respectable cover of war business. He was not a duke in the pure English sense, though half Virginia used the title because wealth, lineage, and power have always invented noble language for themselves in the colonies when plain terms seem insufficient. Widowed young, master of immense plantations and shipping interests, guardian of men whose debts could ruin or enrich smaller counties, Vexley moved through the tidewater world with the grave authority of someone who had buried too much and learned from grief how little performance mattered. His arrival at the parish assembly in late October altered the room before he spoke. Officers made space. Merchants brightened. Mothers studied daughters. Men with uncertain accounts suddenly became eager to appear loyal, useful, or at least memorable. Aldrich, who valued reflected power almost as much as actual power, made certain to attend, and made certain to bring both his wife and Celia. Anwin had seldom hated him more than she did while crossing the assembly floor 2 paces behind the pair of them. Celia's gown that evening was dark gold. Aldrich kept one hand at her elbow with a casual claim more insulting than outright indecency. People saw. People pretended not to see. She herself might have disappeared entirely into the arrangement had one pair of eyes across the room not fixed on it with such still concentration that she felt, almost physically, the moment of recognition. Vexley was speaking to the county magistrate when he looked past him and saw Aldrich with the 2 women. His expression did not dramatically change. It tightened by a degree only. Yet Anwin, who had become expert in reading slight motions because her own survival depended on them, knew at once that he had understood what others preferred to classify as awkwardness instead of cruelty. Later, while Aldrich sat at cards with 2 militia officers and Celia made a little circle of listeners laugh near the windows, Vexley crossed the floor and asked Anwin if he might claim the next dance. It was not a request she could easily refuse. He led her into the set with impeccable form. For the first several turns, he said nothing beyond what convention required. Then, as they crossed and reformed, he said in a tone too even to attract notice, "Your husband is either a fool or a sadist." Anwin nearly missed the step. "You mistake assembly conversation for confession, Your Grace." "I seldom mistake anything I have reason to notice." She kept her eyes on the figures of the dance, then noticed something safer. "No." The word was quiet, so was the force in it. "He means to disgrace you publicly," Vexley said. "And he believes the room will assist him because people confuse good breeding with neutrality. That is not a subject commonly discussed between acquaintances. Then we may classify ourselves differently." She glanced up despite herself. He was older than Aldrich, broader, less polished in the ornamental sense, and far more dangerous in the real one. There was no flirtation in his face, no glimmer of male vanity excited by a wronged woman's distress. What she saw instead was anger pressed into discipline by old practice. "Why should this concern you?" she asked. His jaw moved once before he answered. "Because my sister once stood in a room very like this, and people admired her dignity while she was being destroyed by it." The words entered her cleanly. No embellishment, no plea for sympathy. Only a fact so stark it carried its own history. She said more softly, "What became of her?" "She died before the law grew brave enough to notice what we had all preferred to call domestic sorrow." The figure of the dance separated them then brought them together again. "I am not your sister," Anwin said. "No," he answered. "That is why I am speaking now." When the dance ended, he returned her to her place with formal correctness and no further word. Yet 3 days later, a solicitor known to work under Vexley's protection called at Aldrich Hall regarding irregularities in wartime transport claims and river storage contracts. The pressure began so quietly that only those already afraid of it seemed able to hear the change. Aldrich grew abrupt with clerks. He sent one rider toward York after dark and another toward Williamsburg before breakfast. Bell, the steward, was asked twice in 1 week for keys he had always kept without interference. Celia, who had cultivated indifference as though it were a charm against moral consequence, started waking late and drinking fortified wine before noon. A chest of papers disappeared from the study and was found half-burned in the yard furnace after rain had spoiled the fire. One tenant's son, dismissed for insolence, was overheard in the stable cursing the whole house for thieves. Anwin added every detail to her pages. At the same time, Vexley's inquiries widened. Through his solicitor, he examined timber assessments, militia wagon contracts, and debt transfers attached to lands in 3 adjacent counties. One altered paper led to another. A second signature failed to match the first. A shipment, nominally carrying flour, proved weighted for something denser. A mortgage appeared to have been represented under 2 separate instruments in different hands. Somewhere in the middle of this web lay a cluster of documents touching the estate that had once belonged to Anwin's mother's brother. Modest land, but profitable, and absorbed into Aldrich's reach under circumstances she had never fully understood. Vexley did not come riding to the house as some theatrical rescuer. He moved through attorneys, magistrates, account books, and men whose loyalty weakened in proportion to the likelihood of imprisonment. This, more than any grand gesture, made Aldrich afraid. Still, fear alone would not free Anwin. Exposure might ruin her husband, but unless she herself acted, the county could easily tell the story afterward in a way that left her no more than property transferred from one powerful man's influence to another's. Vexley explained as much one storm-heavy evening in the old library at Aldrich Hall. Aldrich had ridden out to inspect a disputed tobacco warehouse along the river. Celia had a headache and had withdrawn. Bell, bribed perhaps by conscience or perhaps by dread, admitted Vexley privately through the side entrance, and then disappeared so completely that no servant seemed to belong to the house for the next half hour. The library smelled of wet wool, extinguished ash, and old calfskin. Rain moved against the long windows in diagonal streaks. "I can make formal trouble for him," Vexley said once the door was shut. "Possibly enough to break his position. But if that is done before you stake your own claim, society will say you were rescued, not vindicated. Anwin stood near the window with one hand resting on the frame. There are days when rescue sounds tolerable. Only to those who have not survived it. She looked at him sharply. He continued in the same calm tone. What I mean is this. If I intervene first, they will call you weak. If I intervene after you, they may call you scandalous. But if you do not intervene at all, you will remain legally enclosed by a man who has already proved what he believes your silence is worth. Anwin said nothing. Vexley laid out papers on the table between them as he spoke. Draft petitions, extracted testimony, comparative signatures, a physician's memorandum, notes regarding fraudulent inducement, malicious injury to reputation, and non-consummation sufficient to support annulment if corroborated. Even seeing the final phrase in ink made her pulse turn cold. You can ask the law to look at that, she said. It prefers not to, but yes. They will laugh. Some will, others will calculate. A few may even feel shame, though I never advise depending upon that. She moved closer to the table and forced herself to read. If I petition, every private wound becomes public curiosity. Yes. And if I do not? He keeps your name, your family's property, and the narrative he has already written around your body. The room seemed to narrow. You speak as if this were simple. No, he said. I speak as if it is necessary. He touched another paper. There is more. We believe a surviving male heir exists through your mother's line, your brother Rowan. She stared at him. My brother died at 16. That is what you were told. The blood left her face. Not died, Vexley said quietly. Removed. Sent to Maryland under another branch of the family after a chain of debt manipulations made his presence inconvenient to the men managing your maternal inheritance. He is alive, and he has been found. For one suspended second, hope hurt more than despair. Then her hand went to the back of the chair to steady herself. You are certain? As certain as a man becomes before he sends the rider himself. The first tears she had shed for anything in months rose then, not from weakness, but from the violent shock of possibility. She turned away because she would not cry before him if she could help it. Yet his next words undid her more than pity would have done. You may take time, he said. I am not owed your composure. That restraint, so different from Aldrich's appetite for any visible crack in her, made her shut her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was raw. If Rowan lives, why hide it from me? Because a missing heir is easier to replace than a dead fraud. By the time Aldrich returned from the river, dripping temper and mud into the front hall, Anwin had resumed her ordinary mask. But mask and mind are not the same thing. Behind hers, the shape of the future had changed. Rowan arrived 6 days later. He came not with elegance, but with urgency. One hard-ridden horse, one cloak dark with road dust, one narrow trunk strapped behind the saddle, and a face older, leaner, and more weathered than the boy she remembered. Yet the moment he crossed the side garden and turned toward the house, she knew him. Not only by his eyes or the line of his mouth, but by the sudden, unbearable rightness of his presence inside the world. She met him halfway down the path. They embraced with none of the composure their mother would once have demanded in view of servants. Mrs. Bell, who had followed at a prudent distance with a shawl, burst into tears. 2 footmen stared determinedly at the gravel. Rowan held his sister as if trying to account by force for every year stolen from them. I thought you dead, she whispered. I thought you safe, he answered. God forgive us both for believing liars. His story came in fragments over the next hours and completed itself only later. After their mother's death, certain debts tied to her brother's estate had been inflated, transferred, and quietly folded into arrangements that favored men already in league with Aldrich's father. Rowan, still young and troublesome enough to question figures, had been declared impractical, then conveniently apprenticed away under the charge of a distant relation in Maryland. Letters were diverted. Messages failed to arrive. By the time he understood how thoroughly he had been erased from home, years had passed, and his own position was too uncertain to win a hearing without documents. Those documents he now brought with him: copied parish records, family correspondence, an inventory signed before witnesses, and one minister's note mentioning the boy Rowan being sent away until the inheritance question be cooled. When Aldrich entered the supper room that night and found Rowan seated there beside his wife, his face changed in a way Anwin would remember all her life. "What is the meaning of this?" he said. Rowan rose slowly. He had their mother's eyes and none of her caution left in him. "The beginning of your inconvenience." Aldrich laughed too quickly. "I do not receive strangers at my table who announce themselves in riddles." "Then receive me as kin," Rowan said. "I am sure the title sits worse with you." The exchange that followed remained outwardly civil only because servants were present and because Aldrich still believed bluster might serve. Yet from that evening onward, the house changed temperature. He stopped speaking of Celia quite so openly. He questioned Belle until the steward took to sleeping with his keys under the pillow. He sent for a lawyer from York. He accused Anwin of disloyal correspondence. He attempted, clumsily, to charm Rowan with offers of settlement and hunting rights. None of it worked. Meanwhile, Vexley's work accelerated. One clerk broke first, then a second. Celia Marrow, panicked by the prospect of being abandoned with jewels not wholly her own and no legal protection against the household's collapse, tried to leave before dawn with a case of plate and personal gifts. She was stopped in the yard by a sheriff operating under a writ attached to the broader fraud inquiry. By noon, she was in tears. By evening, she was bargaining. Celia's vanity had long been stronger than her courage. Once she understood that Aldrich meant to cast every impropriety onto weaker shoulders, she began to speak. Not nobly, not from repentance, but with the practical desperation of a woman who saw prison, poverty, and social extinction standing in the same doorway. She admitted that Aldrich had boasted to her of keeping his wife untouched and therefore indefinable, as he put it, while still maintaining a husband's legal command over her property. He had laughed that a woman denied the proofs of marriage could be denied the remedies of injury as well, because modesty itself would bind her tongue. He had described Anwin's reserve as a convenience, and her reputation as clay to be shaped before witnesses. That sentence, once placed under oath, moved through the county more swiftly than winter fever. Yet even with all this, Anwin found the hardest part was not gathering proof. It was preparing to speak. For weeks she had acted, planned, copied, conferred. Those labors made her feel almost detached from the wound itself. But as the hearing drew near and the church court prepared to examine her petition for annulment and associated claims, she understood that every step of courage now converged upon a single public act no one could perform on her behalf. The evening before the hearing, she sat alone in her chamber, reading over the draft petition, while candle wax slid down in pale ridges and rain ticked at the glass. The phrases looked at once too legal and too intimate. Malicious injury to reputation, failure of conjugal fulfillment, fraudulent inducement, coercive control over inherited property. So much of a woman's life reduced to words men might pronounce in a room and then carry home as anecdote. She was not afraid of Aldrich himself anymore. That had changed without her fully noticing when. What frightened her now was the room, its eyes, its appetite, its memory. Public judgment in Virginia could forgive male vice if elegantly worn. It rarely forgave a woman for naming what she had endured. The next morning, she could not at first fasten her own hands into steadiness. She stood before the window in her plain, dark gown while the chamber blurred in the gray light. Her breath came shallow. When Rowan knocked, she told him to enter, and then wished she had not, because the sight of anyone who loved her made self-command more difficult, not less. "You need not do this today," he said. "Yes, I do." "You may delay. And let him gather one more week? One more whisper? One more paper buried?" Rowan did not answer. A moment later there was a second knock. Vexley. Rowan looked toward her. She nodded. Vexley entered and stopped at a distance that honored both the room and her distress. He took in her expression, the petition on the table, the hands she had not yet stilled. "I can wait outside," he said. "No," Anwin answered, though she was not certain why. Perhaps because he had never once used her vulnerability as a doorway. He inclined his head. "Then I will say only this. My sister asked for time because everyone around her praised patience. I gave it to her. Others gave it to her. The law gave it to her. By the time anyone acted, time had become another accomplice to the man who harmed her." He paused. "I will not urge patience upon you, but I will not take this decision from you either. If you walk into that chamber, let it be because you choose your own name over his convenience." That was what steadied her. Not protection, not command. Choice. Anwin drew one breath, then another. "Then let it be my choice." The hearing filled the parish chamber beyond comfort. Ministers, magistrates, county ladies, merchants, officers, and every respectable scavenger who fed on public misfortune seemed to have found reason to attend. Damp cloaks steamed faintly near the door. Candles burned despite the hour because the sky remained heavily overcast. Ink, wool, wet leather, and curiosity thickened the air. Aldrich came dressed with insulting care. His coat was excellent, his wig precisely arranged. He looked, at first glance, like a man inconvenienced by feminine theatrics, rather than one standing at the edge of collapse. That first glance did not survive the evidence. The physician testified that he had been consulted in circumstances suggesting the marriage had never been completed. A maidservant from the adjoining chambers testified regarding locked doors, separate nights, and the pattern of drinking, anger, and absence. Bell, gray with dread, produced corrected ledgers and named the nights on which he had been ordered to alter entries concerning rents and timber rights. Rowan laid before the magistrates the letters proving deliberate manipulation of the maternal inheritance and his own removal from expectation. Vexley's solicitor introduced transport contracts, duplicated mortgages, forged endorsements, and land transfers that pointed toward a broad structure of fraud reaching far beyond private vice. Celia testified with ruined composure and a handkerchief she twisted nearly to threads. When asked whether Lord Aldrich had ever spoken of his wife's condition in marriage, she shut her eyes and said yes. When asked for his words, she repeated them. Several people in the room visibly flinched. Aldrich tried outrage first. He declared himself slandered by servants, harlots, and meddlers with political ambitions. He implied that Vexley sought county influence under the pious disguise of defending female injury. He suggested that Anwin's temperament had long been disordered, and that any reserve in the marriage bed arose from her own unnatural aversion. For a brief, ugly stretch of minutes, his confidence almost worked. Men like him often prosper because they understand the ancient appetite to believe a husband over a woman, especially if the husband speaks loudly enough. Then Anwin stood. She had imagined the moment a dozen times in dread. In reality, it came with an odd stillness. The room quieted not because it was kind, but because it sensed it had reached the point of maximum injury. She could feel every eye. She could hear rain against the eaves. She could smell candle smoke and damp broadcloth and the iron tang of fear that had at last shifted sides. The minister asked whether she would state her complaint before the court. Yes, she said. Her own voice sounded calmer than she felt. That gave her strength. I was married, she said, under assurances of lawful union and honorable protection. Instead, I was placed in a household where my inheritance was used, my name was diminished, and my person was made the subject of a false narrative designed to keep me silent. Aldrich moved as if to interrupt. The magistrate raised a hand. Anwin went on. He wished me shamed enough to remain obedient. He believed that by denying me the actual rights of a wife, while claiming the power of a husband, he could leave me without remedy. He believed modesty would do his work for him. He was wrong. No line shouted could have struck harder. She spoke then not only of the marriage chamber, but of the months around it, the public insinuations, the mistress installed across the gallery, the pressure placed upon tenants tied to her mother's estate, the papers moved and altered in her husband's confidence that a wife taught to preserve. Decorum would never study accounts closely enough to understand what was being taken. I was expected, she said at last, to become smaller each time he wronged me. Instead, I learned to observe. If there is scandal here today, it is not that a woman has spoken. It is that so many people found it easier to live beside cruelty than to name it. The silence after that did not belong to her enemies anymore. Aldrich's face lost color. It was the first truly unguarded expression she had ever seen on him. Not anger, not contempt, shock, because power like his always imagines itself safest inside the habits it teaches others. He had trained a county to look away. He had not imagined someone he despised could retrain the room in a single hour. The decree did not fall that instant, but the structure of the outcome did. Within a fortnight, the marriage was annulled. The findings cited non-consummation, fraudulent inducement, public injury, and associated irregularities in property handling. Civil proceedings widened around the financial frauds. Aldrich's immediate control over the disputed maternal estate was frozen and then overturned. Properties held under false instruments were restored to the proper line, with Rowan's claims acknowledged and Anwin's separate rights clarified more strongly than any woman in the county had expected the law to do for one of her sex. The county, which had fed so greedily on her embarrassment, now attempted admiration. Women praised her composure with the same mouths that had once advised patience. Men saluted her courage as if they had not laughed at Aldrich's old remarks over claret. Anwin accepted none of this false conversion. She had learned too much about public virtue to mistake it for moral memory. She left Aldrich Hall under her own name. That departure was quieter than many of the humiliations she had endured there, yet to her it felt larger than any triumph anyone might have staged. The trunks were not numerous. She had entered the house with more finery than she chose to carry out. What mattered were the documents, the account books, the family letters, the corrected surveys, the keys returned lawfully, and the knowledge that when the carriage door shut upon her and Rowan beside her, she was not being transferred. She was leaving. They settled first in the smaller maternal house, while the reclaimed estate was inspected, repaired, and disentangled from years of deceit. It was not a grand residence. Wind moved too freely under one set of shutters. 2 roofs needed work. One orchard wall had collapsed where no one cared to mend it during the disputed years. Yet from the first evening, it possessed something Aldrich Hall had never offered her: moral air. Here, Anwin's transformation, begun in secret pages, became visible in action. She dismissed 2 servants whose delight in past humiliations had revealed itself too clearly after the house changed hands. She retained Mrs. Bell and 3 others who had shown kindness when kindness had been costly. She sat with solicitors until estate law ceased to sound like a foreign dialect invented by men to keep women ornamental. She walked the tenant lines with Rowan, asking not merely what was owed, but what had been taken, delayed, or distorted under Aldrich's administration. She learned which fields needed drainage, which boundaries invited dispute, which leases could be renegotiated more justly, which accounts were false only in part, and which were false to the root. What astonished her most was not that she could learn these things, but that she had ever been taught to think learning them improper. Vexley remained nearby, though never so near that his presence could be mistaken for conquest. He visited first on legal business and later on estate matters, only partly legal. He advised when asked. He recommended a surveyor and then accepted her refusal of a second one when she judged the first competent enough. He brought Rowan 2 letters regarding tobacco prices and stayed afterward to discuss drainage with Anwin rather than speaking over her to the nearest man. In all these small manners, he did something Aldrich had never once attempted. He treated her judgment as real. Love, when it grew between them, did not arrive as rescue bathed in gratitude. It came by slower and more durable means. Trust, respect, shared anger stripped of performance. The recognition that each had seen the other at a threshold where public life ends and choice begins. There were evenings when they spoke of his sister, though never lightly. Her name had been Eliza. Married into a family that prized appearances more than mercy, she had suffered under a husband protected by status, silence, and the reluctance of respectable people to interfere. Vexley had believed for too long that time and careful persuasion might solve what law and force would later only belatedly expose. By the time he understood the cost of patience, she was dead of a fever brought on in a house already weakened by fear and neglect. "I have spent years wondering whether I loved decorum more than her life," he said once in the half-restored west parlor while winter light silvered the windows. Anwin answered, "No, but you may have trusted the world to deserve the restraint you offered it." He looked at her then with that grave steadiness she had first seen at the assembly. "And you?" "I mistook endurance for virtue," she said. "Not because it was noble, because it was familiar." The crates still stood against one wall. The curtains had not yet been rehung. Snowlight made the room appear unfinished and peaceful at once. "I thought healing would feel soft," she said after a moment. "Instead, it feels like structure. Brick laid back into place. A door rehung so it shuts against weather." A faint sadness touched his smile. "You speak like a builder." "I was forced to become one." "Then the man who stands beside you must deserve the house you rebuilt." In the first months of her marriage, Anwin would have lowered her eyes before such a sentence, unsure whether it concealed a claim. Now she simply held his gaze and weighed the truth in it. "There was a time," she said, "when I would have mistaken protection for love. And now? Now I know protection can be another form of ownership if the wrong man offers it." His voice lowered. "I do not offer ownership." "No," she said. "You do not." She crossed the room then by her own choosing. When he took her hand, It was with a reverence so free of performance that all the false gallantries of county society seemed suddenly childish by comparison. Their understanding declared itself in the spring, after the final property orders settled, and after Rowan, with a laugh roughened by years of hardship, informed them both that the entire county had already begun speaking as if the matter were only waiting for ink. Anwin's second marriage was not arranged over her head. It was not a bargain struck in fear. It was a vow entered with open eyes by a woman who now knew the weight of her own consent. The county took to calling her Duchess soon afterward, partly in admiration, partly because people find it easier to honor female strength once it stands beside visible rank. Anwin wore the title without allowing it to rewrite the journey that led to it. She had not been transformed by ornament. She had become larger than her disgrace long before any society titles settled over her shoulders. Years later, she returned once to Aldrich Hall to sign the final sale papers after the estate had been broken apart under debts, claims, and penalties. The great house smelled of damp stone and extinguished vanity. The mirrors were dim. The withdrawing room, where Celia had once stood in plum silk, looked smaller than memory had made it. Anwin walked through it without triumph. That was her true liberation. Revenge, she had learned, is often imagined too noisily. People think justice must roar to satisfy. Sometimes it is quieter and far more complete. A cruel man loses his estate, his standing, his easy smile before witnesses. A county that helped him learns belated embarrassment. Records are corrected, boundaries restored, names returned, and the woman he tried to make smaller walks through the ruins without needing to feel anything at all. Lord Aldrich had wanted a silent wife, a captive inheritance, and a house where humiliation could be staged like music after supper. Instead, he created the witness who would undo him. He mistook reserve for emptiness, patience for surrender, and feminine decorum for permanent obedience. By the time he understood the difference, the law had turned, the ledgers had spoken, and the woman he had tried to define had stepped wholly beyond his reach. Anwin's life did not become a fairy tale after that. No honest life does. There were still lawsuits in smaller matters, poor harvest years, one fever summer that nearly emptied the tenant cottages, Rowan's stubbornness over drainage expenses, and the ordinary griefs from which rank protects no one. But her life became hers. She restored the estate stolen from her mother's line. She defended Rowan's place without surrendering her own. She learned the language of property, witness, and law not as curiosities in a man's world, but as tools she had every right to wield. And when she stood beside Vexley in public, respected at last not as a woman under shelter, but as one whose strength had remade her own future, the deepest change was not in the title society gave her. It was in the quiet certainty with which she inhabited it. She had begun as a wife taught to survive humiliation by making herself smaller inside it. She became a woman who understood another law entirely. Nothing is healed cleanly until truth is named. Nothing is reclaimed until fear loosens its grip. And sometimes the most devastating answer to cruelty is not the spectacle of a villain falling, but the calm, public, undeniable proof that he never owned the future he tried to steal.